Going to speak first. David.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Great to see everyone tonight. Great to see so many cars out on the road there. It feels like March of 2022 again. I felt like I should just jump in here quickly since Adam and I are good friends. We met 10 years ago. I've mentioned Adam many times here before, and if you recall, I've shared information that he put together, had some great feedback, which has been really helpful. So I haven't seen Adam's presentation, but I know he has something to show on the screen, so some of you may want to move a little bit closer to the front here. And with that, I think I was going to turn you over to Adam, but I think Kirsten's going to have a quick... Oh, no. Okay. So without further ado, my good friend, our good friend, the 21st century, Adam Smith.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Smith, and no, that's not a pseudonym. Believe it or not, my mother, a highly educated woman with a master's degree, had no idea who the Scottish economist was when she named me. I am here today to talk about change, systems change, to be specific. Wait, 1 second, we'll just wait for the PowerPoint to get up here. Some people say the system is broken because people are slipping through the cracks, because poverty and inequality persist, because the power of the elite is insurmountable. Make no mistake, the system is working exactly as it was designed to do, which is to ensure the wealthy stay wealthy at the expense of everyone else. This is precisely the kind of system you get when it's honed by wealthy elite psychopaths over thousands of years. The economy. What we call the economy is the sum of all human behavior in a given area. There are many different ways to measure the economy, and there could be many different ways to structure an economy, but the wealthy elite have successfully managed over the last century to propagate one particularly insidious ideology on pretty much the entire global economy. That ideology is called neoliberalism. At its core, neoliberalism is the notion that the private sector and the almighty market reign supreme, and the public sector is just there to facilitate the wealth extraction of the private sector. The almighty market is neoliberalism's god and must not be interfered with by the government. Only the biggest private players and their supranational corporations are allowed undue influence to game the market in their favor. Neoliberalism goes hand in hand with capitalism because of its prioritization of private profits and removal of any regulations that would slow or hamper the ability of the wealthy elite to exploit and extract more wealth from workers. Part of the allure of neoliberalism is the technical sheen it hides behind. All the specious math and economic formulas used to justify inequitable policies have made it very successful because the technical claims are hard to counter. And neoliberals recruit some of the smartest minds to prop up this technical facade, using a highly educated technocracy to create fanciful and convoluted and complex theories that do not actually reflect reality, but rather the profit needs of the elite. In post-secondary institutions, pretty much all of which are just neoliberal indoctrination factories, they silo the various specialties of the technocrats into very narrow subjects, so they become experts in just a small slice of the economy, but never see the larger picture. Our economic system is specifically an infinite growth economic system. It requires infinite exponential growth or it collapses. I find the best analogy, which I will return to a few times, is the economy is like a car that's been designed with no brakes and no reverse. It can only go forward or crash. The two most popular ways to measure an economy are gross domestic product, or GDP, and growth. GDP per capita supposedly tells you how much average wealth there is per person in a country, and the growth of GDP tells you how fast that country's wealth is growing. A recession is when that growth turns negative for a short while. A depression is when that negative growth is prolonged. They also like to measure GDP to debt ratios, but we'll talk about later about why those are meaningless. So what does GDP actually mean? Well, all GDP is a measure of how much money is sloshing around in an economy. Every dollar of deficit spending by the federal government is an increase in GDP, just as every dollar in federal taxes reduces GDP. But GDP tells us nothing. It doesn't tell us if poverty reduced, if less children went to bed hungry, if more teens graduated high school, if infant mortality improved, if crime reduced. Nothing. Nothing but the amount of money in a given area. As I'm sure most of you already know, money is at the heart of it all. A quote from English-Canadian economist James Kenneth Galbraith: "The process by which banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled. Where something so important is involved, a deeper mystery seems only decent. Truer words were never spoken." There is only one definition and property of money. It is a medium of exchange. Many people claim real money has other properties like being physical, fungible, divisible, and a store of value, but those things are not necessary for money to function as a medium of exchange. All something requires to become money is for two parties to agree it is money and use it as such, because money is just an idea in our heads. Money is an imaginary concept. For the federal government to say they don't have enough of it is admitting they don't have enough imagination. I've learned from experience, especially with my friend David Ward, there is little point to me trying to explain the monetary system verbally, especially not to people who are unfamiliar with the topic. I have an animated video in the works for a couple years, but I haven't got there yet. But here is a few facts about the monetary system. Number one, the entire monetary system is nothing more than double entry accounting. It's all just numbers on ledgers that get created simultaneously on both sides of a balance sheet. To create an asset, you must also create a liability. If you extinguish a liability, you are also going to extinguish an asset. It's entirely just addition and subtraction of numbers on ledgers. Money is no longer arbitrarily limited based on the supply of any physical substance like gold. It has zero attachment to the physical world. There is nothing that backs the system except our faith in it. Number two, all money is created as debt, with only one exception, coins. Leaving that exception aside for a moment, that means every kind of money, whether cold hard cash or a bank deposit or your credit card, was created along with some form of debt. Cash is matched by government bonds at our central bank. Bank deposits are either from bank loans or federal government spending, which is created from federal debt. This means that the money supply cannot increase unless debt also increases. The monetary system is just new debts paying off old debts in a never-ending spiral of increasing debt. Number three, if money is the fuel of the economic car, private banks are the gas station pumping it into the economy. Yes, every time a person takes a loan, whether a business loan, line of credit, or a mortgage, that is brand new money creation by a private bank. Through their charter, they have the power to create money at will. Here's a little known fact. Does anyone know the origins of the word mortgage? It's actually two French words. This is legit too. You can look it up yourself. This is two French words put together, mort and gage, which literally translates to death pledge. Yes, it was a euphemism because of how long the term of a mortgage is. It was like signing your death pledge, which is why in Quebec and all of Europe, they call it a hypothèque, because who the hell in their right minds wants to sign their death pledge? Well, the English, I guess. The amount of money created by private banks dwarfs that created by the federal government many times over. A classic red herring of neoliberals is to blame federal deficit spending for anything wrong in the economy, in particular inflation, on the grounds that the government creating and spending money is somehow a huge impact, purposefully ignoring that private banks pump out over 10 times what the feds do. At least when the Fed's deficit spend, it doesn't burden people with debt, whereas every deposit created by banks comes from a loan with interest on it. Central banking. Central banking is an esoteric, convoluted, and counterintuitive system designed that way on purpose to ensure very few people outside of finance can ever wrap their heads around it. The most obvious example of this is what I call bank speak, the language bankers use to obfuscate how things really work. In my longer version of this speech, which I will make available to anyone, I illustrate some examples of bank speak, but I had to cut them for time. The basics of central banking are as follows. A sovereign nation with its own currency needs a central bank to control that currency and to facilitate the finances of the central government. The federal government does not spend like other levels of government because other levels of government do not own a central bank at which they have an account. The central bank has the power to create unlimited amounts of money for the federal government without ever needing a dime in taxes. Unlike the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada can purchase new securities straight from the feds in primary markets, and upon doing so, directly credits the government with new funds it can spend. This is called monetary financing, and it's why the feds are never constrained in their spending, nor can they ever default on anything in Canadian dollars. That is what makes us monetarily sovereign. The central bank is responsible for banknotes supplied to banks for their ATMs, and also supplies the reserves that banks use to settle up with each other at the end of the day. In Canada, we call reserves settlement balances, but I prefer the term reserves. These reserves are the core of the banking system. Banks need them to square with each other, and the central bank controls the supply and cost of these reserves. Banks also use reserves to buy government bonds and T-bills and lend their excess reserves to each other in the overnight market. The central bank controls the cost of reserves by setting the key interest rate, also known as the policy interest rate, also known as the target for the overnight rate. Part of bank speak is having multiple names for the same thing. In Canada, we do not have reserve requirements. Banks are not required to keep a portion of reserves unused every day. Instead, we control the cost of reserves and their lending by having an interest rate band. The details of that are in my long version. I'm going to talk a bit more about interest rates when I get into inflation, but first a little on federal government finance. As mentioned, in a monetarily sovereign nation, the federal government is not constrained from spending depending on how much taxes they collect or bonds they sell. However, neoliberal ideology still dictates that the government constrain itself. This is why in the US they talk of the debt ceiling, which is simply a self-imposed limit they keep raising over and over. In Canada, we have a few examples of catering to neoliberal constraints. The devastating across-the-board 25% Chrétien cuts of the 90s were to appease neoliberals because supposedly our debt had gotten too high. Too high for what? Public debt is not a burden to a monetarily sovereign nation. We can always pay out our bonds and T-bills. It is literally impossible to default. More importantly, and another point the neoliberal elites do not want the public to understand, is that a public sector deficit is a private sector surplus. One of the most prevalent and deceiving tropes is comparing the federal government to a household. We have to live within our means. We are burdening future generations with debt. Total nonsense. Not just because we are monetarily sovereign, but also because that ignores the accounting. They are only looking at one side of the balance sheet. We are taught that a surplus is good and a deficit is bad. Sure, if you're a household or business. But if you're the federal government, when you have a deficit, that means you spent more than you taxed, which means you left more money in people's pockets. If the government has a surplus, that means they taxed more than they spent. They took more from people than they gave back in services. When you think about it in those terms, you realize that from the point of view of the public, a deficit is always giving more than it takes and contributes more money to the economy, while a surplus actually shrinks the money supply. And when most people talk about the supposed need for the government to pay down public debt, they fail to realize that the only way to have funds to pay down debt is if the government runs a surplus and taxes more than it spends. And the way the government typically does that is not by raising taxes, God forbid, but by cutting services. Back to Chrétien, the powers that be decided they needed to get in line or else face some mysterious punishment by international bond vigilantes forcing Canada's hand in some unnamed way. Those cuts are the precise moment our hospital beds per capita decline began because of the loss of the 25% of the Health Canada transfer, which was worsened a few years later, at least in Ontario, when Mike Harris came to power and started slashing and burning and downloading onto cities. Provincial and municipal governments do not share the ability of the federal government to spend into infinity. They do rely on taxes and sales of securities and government transfers to fund their spending. And it is because the feds have this vast power that neoliberals seek to constrain them. Because first and foremost, you don't want the public to know the feds are not monetarily constrained. You don't want people to know it's a lie when the federal government says they don't have money. Like when Trudeau lied to veterans saying you're asking for more than we have to spend. Complete and utter bullshit. Pardon my French. The wealthy elite have a vested interest in the public not understanding that money comes out of nowhere and that the elite can't have the government spending so much on the public that inequality improves. The real fear neoliberals have of government spending is that it will prove to the public that not only do we not need the private sector for many of our essentials, but that we can get everything much cheaper when we cut out the profits of the private sector. Now, some of you are likely thinking, but the government's always less efficient, the government always screws things up, and that's true. But why is that true? When people switch jobs from the private sector to the public sector or vice versa, do they suddenly become a completely different person? Does the public sector only hire inefficient incompetents? No, we're all humans. The public and private sectors are made up of the same kind of people with the same kind of educations. The difference is the people running the private sector must be efficient to ensure profits keep flowing, and the people running the public sector, our politicians, must be inefficient to ensure justification for privatization of public services. It's sabotage. Noam Chomsky said it best. That's the standard technique of privatization. You defund, make sure things don't work, people get angry, you hand it over to private capital. Many studies have shown that the public sector is at worst just as efficient as the private sector, and usually it's more efficient. If the public sector is doing a lousy job, it's because there's an elected psychopath in charge sabotaging things from the inside. Years ago, the Auditor General of Ontario found that we were overpaying by billions because of contracting out government work that would have been cheaper to keep in-house. We're seeing this now with Trudeau and McKinsey and Company too, paying for expensive contracts that should be handled by our own bureaucracy. The neoliberal logic is that anything that can be made profitable should be left to the private sector, because if the public sector is doing it for cheaper, that's lost profits for corporations. Now, the semi-valid point of neoliberals is that a monetarily sovereign government that does not constrain itself will inevitably go too far and cause some kind of negative disruption to the economy, especially inflation or worse, hyperinflation. But that never happens when the government is simply spending on the public good, like building needed infrastructure or funding schools and hospitals. Hyperinflations always occur not solely because of government money printing, it always requires some external factor to become a hyperinflation. There we go. Milton Friedman once famously said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. What a load of neoliberal horseshit. Never were less true words spoken. But those words fueled a neoliberal revolution of banking and finance that we're still tangled in today. Inflation is the loss of money's purchasing power, or more simply, inflation is a rise in prices. The notion that government money printing alone causes inflation is an obsolete notion from World War II and earlier times when supply of goods was much more scarce and there was much greater competition for goods. If there was too much money with which to buy goods, it could lower supply. And with low supply, prices go up because retailers have less to sell to make the same profit. Myths about money printing and hyperinflation abound, like the Weimar Republic in the 30s. But most people don't realize that other external forces were the cause, primarily heavy reparations payments and currency speculators. Unless an increase in the money supply causes an increase in consumer demand, which then lowers supply, it simply cannot cause inflation, especially if the increase in money is not going to buy goods and services, but rather to invest in financial assets or just get saved. In the context of a large, modern, globalized, mixed economy such as Canada, where supply of most goods is plentiful regardless of their price, inflation is almost entirely exogenous, meaning from external sources. The idea that inflation can be controlled by controlling the money supply was disproven by the experience of Canada and many other nations that attempted monetarism. From the mid-70s to early 80s, using high interest rates and targeting the growth of the money supply, Canada tried and failed to contain the inflation that was sparked by the OPEC oil crisis in 1973. Now, even the Federal Reserve admits that inflation has a very unreliable connection to the money supply. So, what does cause inflation? The most common source of current inflation is low supply, which can be due to poor crop yields, typically caused by bad weather or pests. Labor disruptions, such as COVID, causing lumber production to stop. Supply chain backlogs, such as COVID, causing a slowdown of international shipping. Inflation is also due to rising costs, such as oil prices making transportation more costly, wage increases for workers, a lower exchange rate making a country's imports more expensive, interest rates making debt more expensive, or an increase in overhead costs like higher rent or utility bills. And sometimes inflation is simply a choice to raise prices by producers, suppliers, and retailers, which we are seeing right now with our largest corporate grocery chains raising prices while rolling in record profits just because they can. When inflation bumps up, The psychopathic profit-seeking logic of corporations see it as justification for raising prices. Because why not if the public is starting to expect inflation anyways? This can also happen when a company or cartel has a monopoly and so can set prices as it pleases because it has no competition, like our telcos in Canada. Now, let's get back to interest rates and using them as a tool to combat inflation. I have a lot to say on this topic after all the books I read on Canada's last inflationary period, and it baffles me, after reading all that history, how over 40 years later, we're making the same mistakes using the same baseless neoliberal ideology. In short, monetary policy and interest rates are useless against inflation because monetary policy and interest rates did not cause the inflation. How can monetary policy solve what it didn't cause? Monetary policy was not the culprit for any of the sources of inflation I listed previously. Monetary policy didn't cause COVID, it didn't create supply chain bottlenecks, it didn't cause crop failures, and it certainly didn't cause corporate price gouging. And it can't stop any of those things either. So, what's the point, you may ask? First, let's delve into the neoliberal logic for a moment. The faulty, obsolete, and thoroughly disproven logic of using interest rates to influence inflation is espoused perfectly by that quote from Friedman. The incorrect assumption is that all inflation is simply a matter of too much money chasing too few goods. And if inflation is low, it's because there's not enough money out there. No other factors matter except the money supply and inflation. Following that logic, the price of money is determined by interest rates. If you feel there's too much money in the economy and you want people and businesses to borrow less, you raise interest rates. Ironically, this will have the opposite effect, raising the cost of many things for people, like their mortgage. If the powers that be feel inflation is low and the economy is sluggish, they lower interest rates to encourage more borrowing and pump fresh money into the economy. I'm sure everyone here can see the many flaws in this approach, and we must realize the fiendish logic behind raising rates. Ultimately, it's meant to bring on a mini recession. It's literally intended to starve people out until their consumption slows and retailers must slow their price increases or see even more business dry up. It is also intended fully to cause unemployment, to keep wage demands low. Businesses can keep lower prices if they can maintain lower wages, and the more people out of work and competing for jobs, the lower of wages that can be offered. NAIRU at play. NAIRU is something I put in the full speech, the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. This is the twisted and psychopathic logic of neoliberal ideology. Instead of attacking the roots of inflation, which inevitably involves tackling the pricing power of our largest corporations, they use this faulty logic that was disproven half a century ago. The worst part is, lowering inflation doesn't reverse price increases, it just slows them down. To reverse price increases is called deflation, and the system is not designed for that. Here's where it all ties together. If the economy is a car that can only go forward or crash, and money is the fuel, then interest rates are the gas pedal. You want to speed up, you lower the gas pedal. You want to slow down, you let up on the gas pedal. But there are no brakes and there is no turning around. If there is any stop to growth or any deflation reversing prices, the economic car crashes into the house of cards and topples it. This is the nature of an infinite growth economy and a debt-based monetary system. It can never stop or it collapses. If the economy stops growing, new debts cannot pay off old debts, interest just keeps accruing on old debts, and you get defaults left and right. If prices start to deflate, money becomes more valuable to hoard than to spend. And to combat that, the central bank would lower interest rates, but then financial markets would be in a bind because deflation completely messes with inflation expectations. How do you price a bond when the value of money is increasing while doing nothing? Who could you convince to invest when they know just holding their money it's getting more valuable? Inflation is targeted for this reason. They want inflation to keep driving people to earn and invest more, to keep the economic engine running. If inflation is slowly eroding your savings, the smart thing to do is invest it. This helps keep the global casino of financial markets flush with cash. And the choice of 2% inflation is completely psychological. At 2% inflation is low enough it's barely felt, but high enough that those with means will do something about it. Just for reference, at 2% inflation, prices double in 35 years. The economy, the monetary system, financial markets, and inflation are all inextricably tied together. They have been co-designed to self-reinforce a system of elite oppression and wealth extraction. You cannot change one thing without the others failing. which means we must change them all. Hence my call for system change. But there's one other variable in all of this. Who is driving the economic car? I will start by saying I am staunchly nonpartisan. I abhor partisan politics and have never been a member of any political gang. And make no mistake, political parties are nothing more than elite gangs. They want your membership to keep their gang strong, and to be part of the gang, you must pay your dues and adhere to their views. And please understand, if my criticism of your particular gang rubs you the wrong way, then I'm sorry, but you are part of the problem. You are exactly the kind of uncritical person that political gangs love in their ranks, because no matter how badly the party behaves, you will always have their back. They are your gang, and you will always be loyal and vote for them. There is an old truism I'm going to debunk. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Poppycock. The truth is this, power does not corrupt, the corrupt seek power. Doug Ford did not become corrupt. Doug Ford did not become corrupt only upon becoming premier, nor even in his time as counselor. He was already corrupt in high school, dealing drugs and barely graduating to then drop out of college. Donald Trump is another example. He was corrupted long before he became president, even before his notoriety as a failed businessman. Hitler, Mussolini, Saddam Hussein, Genghis Khan, every single Roman emperor, the list goes on. The biggest movers and shakers of history were all textbook psychopaths. Wherever there is power to be had, there is a psychopath vying for it. A brief word on psychopaths. I read my first book on psychopaths years ago called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. And upon learning about the pathology of psychopaths and seeing history through that lens, finally it all made sense. If there's nothing else you take from my talk tonight, I hope it is this. All the evil and inequity in the world comes directly or indirectly from the actions of a psychopath. War, poverty, inequality, slavery. The reason such repugnant policies exist is because of heartless, ruthless, emotionless psychopaths in positions of power. I get deeper into that in the full speech as well. I cannot stress how important it is for people to start not just acknowledging the presence of psychopaths in society, they are anywhere from 3 to 5% of any given population, but to start identifying them and resisting their drive for power. If there is power to be had, there are psychopaths competing ruthlessly for it. Stephen Harper is a textbook psychopath. There's articles in a book written on it. Pierre Poilievre seems to fit the bill too. Former Ontario Liberal leader and now Mayor of Vaughan, Stephen Del Duca, is a total psychopath, and I've met the man. I do not believe Justin Trudeau is a psychopath, but he's completely the puppet of psychopaths running his party and funding the Liberals. It's rare for a leader to be neither psychopath nor puppet because they have to compete with other ruthless psychopaths to get into power. I cannot stand either the Liberals or Conservatives. They are quite literally the source of all their problems because with the exception of Bob Rae's brief time, they are the only parties that have been in charge of this province and this country. The Liberals and Conservatives are just two sides of the neoliberal coin, each taking turns dismantling the public service for corporate gain. Both parties are corrupt to the core, and make no mistake, they both bow to the same corporate masters. If Scheer had won power in the 2019 election, I guarantee our COVID lockdowns and mandates would not have looked very different. Perhaps they would not have lasted as long, perhaps the convoy could have been avoided, but they would have jumped on the same bandwagon and hailed Big Pharma as our saviors just the same, because they are all neoliberal ideologues. Let's face it, they would have had no choice, because we would have become pariahs on the world stage had we not conformed as other nations did. And that would have affected trade and the economy, and our corporate overlords would not stand for that. Scheer would have been getting a call from the Westons and the Bronfmans telling him to get in line or watch their party be starved of funds. So whether the Libs or Cons take power, there is only ever one winner, the wealthy elite and their supranational corporations. And the wealthy elite don't care which party wins, because under either party, they'll always get their way. Both parties have spent the last 40 years increasing inequality with every tax cut. Both parties have brought us into free trade agreements, devastating our domestic manufacturing. Both parties have catered to the profit needs of corporations first, because that is their job. In a neoliberal world, the job of government is to manage the labor force to facilitate the profits of the wealthy. In a neoliberal context, education is not about enlightening and educating people. It's about training a competent workforce. Healthcare is not about keeping people alive and well. It's about ensuring a reliable and physically capable workforce while also making massive profits for Big Pharma. Housing is not about sheltering people. It's about making P3s to profit developers and creating rental assets for investors. Everything government does is about managing the labor force in service to the owners of the means of production. We are their economic engine, the fodder in their cannons. We do not exist to them except numbers on paper as a resource to be consumed and wealth extracted from like any other commodity. So, what the hell do we do about it? Number one, and here it is, finally, there's some things we can do. They're small things mostly, but number one is think collectively. We need to stop thinking as selfish individual consumers, as the corporate marketing of the elite has indoctrinated us to do, and start thinking of the group, which again, you guys are a great example. Atomizing people into individual consumers concerned only with their individual rights is just another tactic of divide and conquer that allows the elite to more easily rule us. Number two, switch to a credit union. You want to drain the power from private banks? Become a member of a credit union. You have all the same functions as a bank, but slightly better rates and lower fees and way better customer service. My bank had never personally called me. My credit union calls me all the time to ask me what I want to do about certain funds. And I know it seems like quite a hassle to switch banks, but it's not as hard as you think. When I left TD for Meridian years ago, it took me all of 2 hours total to make the switch. Obviously, the more accounts you have, longer it will take, but here's some interesting tidbits. If you didn't know, if the funds are not invested, they're just sitting there, you can switch RRSPs and TFSAs between institutions at no charge. You do not have to cash them out in any way. They can stay protected, switching between institutions. Number three, divest of everything in financial markets. We must drain the global casino of the funds that the psychopathic wealthy elite need to keep gambling our futures away. That doesn't just mean stocks and bonds. That means mutual funds, ETFs, and anything and everything that is part of the casino. But Adam, you might say, you just told us how they target inflation to erode our savings, to encourage investment. Won't this just be screwing ourselves? There is one option, only one option to grow your money that is without risk and does not add to the global casino, GICs. Yes, plain boring vanilla GICs. Every dime in my TFSA and RRSP is invested in a variety of terms of GICs. And right now, because of interest rates, there's a bunch of 1 year and 18-month GICs paying between 5 and 5.25%. Best part is they are zero risk, hence the G in their name. They are guaranteed. Number four, if you can, invest in arable land, which some of you probably already own. Not because it will pay out big time one day, but because it's likely we'll need it. Ford is under the fantasy that we don't need food security in this province, and he will not hesitate to sell off prime farmland for development. We've already seen what supply chain issues caused by our own decisions can do to food prices. Imagine supply chain issues when Mother Nature inevitably throws us a curveball. Investing in undeveloped land is also a step towards Plan B, building off-the-grid self-sustaining communities that can survive the current system collapsing. Number five, and again, something many of you probably already do, learn to grow your own food. In this audience, it's likely some of you are already experts in that arena, but we need more people capable of growing their own food, saving their own seeds, and preserving their produce. If you have the means, build a greenhouse and start learning how to grow year-round. Number six, buy as little as possible, consume less in general, and create as little waste as possible. As a society, we are addicted to luxury and convenience, and many people don't think twice about buying disposable items, or in general, just buying more than they need. A good measure is how much food in your fridge goes to waste because you couldn't eat it in time. The important part isn't even learning to live with less or cutting down on consumption. It's about starving the corporations of their profits and reducing the impacts of excess production. Think of it like this. Every time food goes to waste in your fridge, that's profits you gave to a corporation for nothing. The other is wasting energy. How many people here unnecessarily idle their vehicle, especially in winter? Just like the food waste, that's you giving profits to oil companies for nothing, not to mention avoidable pollution. Or electricity. How many people keep on their lights they don't need or leave the TV on when they're not watching it? That's what I call empty demand. And all that adds up to Ontario having justification for keeping open expensive and potentially disastrous nuclear plants, which just keeps rates high and puts money in the pockets of investors. Waste is important too. Canadians are, and by a large margin, hands down, the biggest waste generators per capita on the planet, believe it or not. More than the US, if you can believe that. We don't seem to care much about disposable single-use items, nor getting rid of things and buying new should they show the slightest wear and tear. Don't give the corporations any more money than you have to. Use things until they completely break down. Not only will this drain some more of their profits, we can cut down on the expense of our waste collection and where to put it. It also prepares us for a more sustainable life when we become accustomed to doing more with less. It's good practice for the seemingly more and more inevitable collapse of the system. Number 7, buy local as much as possible and avoid corporate chains, especially Amazon. Adding to the previous suggestion, we have to be creating microeconomies independent of the system as much as possible while draining corporations of their profits. The system will be forced to adapt if enough pressure mounts, and not pressure from people shouting to change the system, but pressure because of people leaving the system and draining it of labor and wealth. I hold no hope that the short-sighted psychopaths in charge can ever change their tune and do things differently. But if they see the writing on the wall, they'll change if for no other reason than to maintain even a little of their power and profits and try to save the system that they benefit from. Number 8, vote ABLC. Anything but libs or cons. Stop voting for their parties, stop giving them money, drain their coffers and starve them of votes. They've done nothing to deserve your loyalty. We also keep suffering electoral whiplash, where the cons come in and spend their first year or two undoing a bunch of lib policies, and then when the libs return to power, they do the same thing. It's a waste of time and money. And understand too, it doesn't matter how much you like the local candidate. If they were your best friend growing up and you trust them with your life, if they are a member of a party, you aren't voting for that person. You're voting for the party, and that person's seat will empower their party. Voting independent doesn't help either, because they can't get anything done in the legislature. They can only support other people's bills. Now, I do not like the NDP or Greens much. The NDP have abandoned much of their labor roots in order to get more mass appeal, and their leader Singh is full of empty noise, while the federal Greens have completely imploded. However, both the NDP and Greens staunchly support the most important reform to our electoral system, and that's proportional representation. Proportional representation, thank you. Proportional representation is the only way to get a government that actually resembles the will of the people. It also makes it easier for smaller and/or newer parties to get a foothold. A great example in the last federal election is the People's Party. They got nearly 5% of the popular vote, but no seats, because their votes were spread out throughout the nation, whereas the Greens got only just over 2% of the vote, but got 2 seats. Were we to have proportional representation, the People's Party would have MPs right now. Federally, the Greens are a lost cause. Don't bother with them. Provincially, here in Ontario, they are making strides, but they're still far from gaining power. I would suggest to everyone here, if you're not an NDP supporter, hold your nose and vote for them anyway, because should they rise to power, not only will it shake up the system with the first federal NDP win, but they will institute proportional representation and forever reduce the ability of the libs and cons to keep us under the thumb of the elite. You cannot vote for change unless you change your vote. Let's get off the LibCon merry-go-round and see some real change. Number 9, talk about psychopaths and start identifying them. They are everywhere, from politicians and police officers to CEOs and crime bosses. There is power to be had. Most times there's a psychopath holding it, and always there's a psychopath vying for it. Learn about them. There are numerous great books on the topic, and talk to as many people as you can about it. And lastly, number 10, talk about neoliberalism. Talk about how it is the ideology behind the insanity of the infinite growth economy and all that entails. The word neoliberal is only just now starting to penetrate public discourse. Help it along. Start decrying it every chance you get and get other people questioning it, angry about it. We cannot tackle our problems until we equip people to accurately identify the roots of those problems. People need to realize that toxic middle manager hounding everyone at the office is likely a psychopath. People need to realize that the economy is not driven by evidence or best practices, but by insidious ideology that uses specious technocratic language and measures to mask the reality that it is designed to favor the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. The thing is, most people know these things in their hearts already. People can instinctively feel the inherent wrongness of the system. We already know politics is a game of theater by the corrupt. We already know the economy favors the wealthy. The problem is most people don't know the specifics, they just feel it. Without knowledge of the inner workings of the system, it's hard for people to feel confident in convincing others, especially if confronted by a fast-talking, highly intelligent, well-read neoliberal technocrat who can easily spout their ideology and its specious claims and overwhelm a person not equipped to respond. We must have this precise conversation with as many people as possible. We must never stop seeking knowledge. We must never assume we know everything. And most important of all, we must be open to changing our minds when new information comes to light. I used to believe the myth that the Bank of Canada was taken over in some way in 1974. And I carried that myth for years until certain people who knew better kept calling the myth out, and I had to see for myself. I spent nearly a decade researching the myth, and in a research paper proved very thoroughly it was in fact a myth and found out the real story. And now that information is out there on my website for all to see. But I've seen people stick to their guns, refusing to change their provably incorrect views despite the wealth of info to the contrary. Some might call this ego, and it is to a degree for sure, but I think there's something a little deeper that drives such cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. I think people's identities get wrapped up in their worldviews, and on some level they feel if they abandon their worldview, they are betraying themselves. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is no truer measure of the open mind of a whole and reasonable person than to be able to abandon beliefs that have become obsolete. The elite have done a really good job of dividing and conquering us. It's time to come together and start defying their agenda. And that starts not by browbeating and shaming those who disagree with us, but by bringing them into the fold, gently, patiently. And the more we are all working with the same information, the easier that will be. So please, go out, have these conversations, spread the word, do some research, challenge your own views, and most importantly, if you really want to see change, don't be afraid to change yourself. Thank you. We've got Q&A, sure, I totally forgot. Oh, I will tell you. Understandingcanada.ca. That's my website. It's a critique of everything federal, but there's a little side section now where I included my personal website. So like all of the thoughts that I've had that I've been able to write down, the research that I've done, the articles that I've made, understandingcanada.ca has all of that stuff. And a lot of it is focused on the monetary system. So some of it's kind of dry. But yeah, it's, I got a great one in there on the top 10 liberal scandals and corruption. There's a bunch of fun stuff in there. So yeah. Any questions, anything at all? Sorry, did you? Anyone? Oh yeah, I will make this available to anyone who wants it. The written part and the slideshow, not a problem. And I will also make available the longer version of the written one, which just gets into more detail. Sir.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Oh, so they can hear. Oh, I could do it either way.
Hello. Thank you for your.
Yeah, if it's not working, I'll just repeat what you said, sir. Oh. Heard something.
Hello. Okay. Klaus Schwab said February 28th at the World Economic. He said it. G20 meeting. What's he doing that, right?
Oh, something cut out. Sorry.
He stated that. Are we lost again? He stated that he has every leader in the world now on board for the transition into the new digital world, one government currency. So all these things you speak of, we understand how the current system's working. They're on the verge of just getting rid of it, and we got no choice, correct?
Yes and no. I will say this, pulling every economy into here's the thing, what you're talking about will likely never happen simply because of the failures of the Eurozone. The Eurozone knew what it was like to take a bunch of completely different economies and cultures and then put them under one currency and then watch disaster happen. All of the sovereign debt issues that the Eurozone had is because they were no longer, remember I was talking earlier about monetarily sovereign nations? Well, no nation in the Eurozone is monetarily sovereign because they do not control the euro. None, the ECB does, which is not, no nation. And the lessons from the Eurozone and certain other points in history is that you don't have control of your economy if you don't have control over your currency and your monetary system. So he can say, Klaus Schwab can make all the noise he wants, but I highly doubt there are many economies that are gonna get on board with that idea, especially with inflation the way it's been, because it's too much of a risk factor. If you're suddenly tied in with all these other economies and you don't control your money supply, you don't control your interest rates, you literally don't control your economy, and the possibility of inflation or other factors screwing you over are just too high now. So, you know, but to answer another part of your question, what, like, if they truly did decide to impose it, what could we do? You know, obviously, like, this list of things isn't anything concrete that would counter that, but really it would just have to come down to like boycotts and protests and mass walkouts. Like, it's just a total rejection of the system. But again, David and I both were part of this talk at the Rotman School on CBDC, so central bank digital currency. And there was 3 position papers done by Canadians. Usually it was like banks in partnership with universities. And I read all of their proposals, and, you know, they were interesting, but, you know, I'll tell you this, like, they made it as constrained and limited as they possibly could because they didn't want it abused or this or that. But the ways in which they want to constrain it are all the reasons why it will never work and the public will not, you know, be cool with adopting it. It can be imposed on us, but, you know, that's the other thing too. When you impose something like CBDC, that is where the potential for alternate monetary systems start springing up potentially, which is a whole other, you know, bowl of nuts. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, sir, but Klaus Schwab is not to be trusted.
Well, just by reiterate, he stated every leader in the world is on board.
Yeah, then
every leader's on board. So I'd say
exaggerating
I'd be
slash
more
lying.
afraid it's coming than
Yeah,
not.
I guarantee you China's not on board. I guarantee you Japan is not on board.
How can you guarantee that?
Because China and their banking system.
I can show you Canadian government documentation of China that we are now part of their money system on the Canadian government website. I have it in my phone.
What do you mean by
want to
part
see
of their money system?
We are now part of the Chinese government's money system, says the Canadian government,
would-
our documents in government.
I would have to see details.
I will share it with you, sir.
Please, yes.
I am way ahead of
I
what
would
you're
like
sharing
it.
today,
All
I
right.
believe. It's coming.
All right. Any
I have a question about the union banks. Wait,
credit unions.
credit unions. Yes. Oh, sorry. Can you transfer your mortgage from a regular bank to?
No, that becomes tricky. I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but then there is fees involved, and I don't even know if you can, to be honest. I don't know the answer
Do
to
they
that
offer
question.
mortgages? Okay. So if you can get out of your mortgage, then you can get a mortgage with them.
Yes,
Okay.
you could. I mean, I know there's options. I just don't know what the technicalities are or know how much it will cost you in fees to do something like that.
And then I just wanted to say something that the Greens and the NDP have in common is they both will institute a wealth tax if they get into power.
Oh, have they promised that too?
Yes.
Like I said, when I say vote for
So
them,
that-
it's not for any other policy except for electoral reform, because from that moment forward, forever elections will be changed, and then you never have to vote for them again. You can vote with your conscience, vote with your heart.
Yeah.
We have another question here. You talk a lot.
Thank you, Brian. I'm at the credit union and I'm thinking of taking my money out. Are you saying they're safer if the economy tanks? Aren't they going to tank
No,
too?
it's not a matter of that. They are all equally safe. They all are subject to federal deposit insurance, and by the same limits and by the same amounts. All I'm saying by switching to a credit union is it drains the power of the banks. It
Yes.
takes away some of their clout, some of their power. You take away deposits from banks, that messes up, like that lowers their balance sheet, and they can't make as many loans if they're drained of deposits.
Okay, you're saying that the government will never be bankrupt?
The
That they'll
federal
always-
government cannot be bankrupt.
So
It's impossible.
my insurance on my RSP or whatever, as long as it's within the
Yeah, with the federal,
100,000.
like I said, the federal government can always pay out anything that's in Canadian dollars.
Do they have to pay it out? Can they not say like they said to the veterans?
Well, they
"We
can
don't have the
screw over
money"?
all kinds of people in all kinds of different ways.
Okay.
But my point is, it's always a lie. Anytime the federal government says we don't have the money, that's a bald-faced lie.
Okay, I get that. So I'm better in the credit union, at least in
Only
the short
because
term.
it drains the power from the banks.
Yes.
And again, it is a little better, like as you may know, better customer service, slightly better fees, slightly
Oh,
lower.
I know that, and I agree. My manager doesn't know about the bail-in clause that Harper put in. No, but don't worry, she said. And I said, will you freeze my bank account if you find out if you get a phone call, an anonymous phone call from a so-called federal government? Because that happened to my friend. Oh, as long as you behave, that won't happen.
Yeah.
So that's your credit union.
Well, that's my point is like, they are equally safe in that regard. Everything you're talking about doesn't matter bank versus credit union.
Okay.
One's not safer, more reliable than the other. It's strictly how to drain power from the banks.
Got a hand here?
She's got another credit union question.
No, it's not a credit union question. It's actually going along with your option of saying join a credit union. So when we met on the weekend, on Saturday, I know I'm not supposed to really say anything until we've talked about it more tomorrow night, but that is actually one of the items that we voted on, was to join a credit union. So we're vetting that right now. It's a small credit union, and there's more to come on that, but just know that that is an amazing idea that Adam has mentioned, and that is something that we are looking at as of all the spokesperson of all the groups to do. And we have one in mind. We're just vetting it right now for their rules, bylaws, to make sure things like, do you have to be a resident of that city to join that credit union, and a few other things. So that's one of the things that we're vetting, among other things about that. So, but yeah.
There's a phrase I didn't use in this thing that I'll just say that vote with your wallet, guys. Whether it's where you put your money or what you're buying, you're voting with your wallet.
Adam, when you're encouraging people to
Sorry,
vote,
closer. Sorry.
when you're encouraging people to vote for the NDP, going to go proportional government, which government has stood up to what they said they're going to do in the past?
That is an excellent point. Look at Trudeau's lies. Trudeau stole Fair Vote Canada's phrase, make every vote count, to steal votes that for people who are like, well, we're afraid of Harper getting back into power. But we wouldn't necessarily vote Liberal, but you know what? If Liberals are going to institute electoral reform, okay, we'll vote Liberal because they'll, and then he lied his ass off and then changed his mind. So excellent point, sir. However, I will say this, the NDP have been beaten at, the Liberals only picked that up in that one election to steal votes from, potential swing voters or people who would have voted NDP or Green but wanted the Conservatives gone. The NDP have been beating that drum for so long. One, I actually truly believe they just would do it. And two, if they didn't, that would devastate them forever. Like all these NDP voters who've been supporting them because of that would just be like, all right, you're a total sham, you're gone. So I do honestly believe an NDP government would institute electoral reform. A majority, I don't know if they get enough support if they're a minority. But either way, I do believe in my heart of hearts that the NDP would have to stay true to it or look like even bigger lie. Like the Liberals lie through their teeth all the time, but it doesn't matter, everyone's used to it. We've never seen an NDP government. We've never seen what might happen if they got into power and how many provinces they keep, how many they break. And I say, why not take a chance just for once? With what? Oh, Bob Race. So there's an excellent article. There's actually a lot of subterfuge there. There's an excellent article by the Globe and Mail that you can look up. The title is The Hidden History of Bob Rae's Government. And it actually details how he came in with such a progressive agenda that there was a private sector revolt. Conrad Black took out full-page ads in major Canadian newspapers saying, divest of Ontario, take your money out, screw this guy. A lot of the problems under Bob Rae were caused by the private sector rebelling against his policies and doing everything they could to pull the rug out from under him.
Just
Pre-Bob Rae wouldn't have been NDP.
question on credit unions. Are they tied in like the banks were under the Emergency Act, where they could freeze accounts?
Oh yes. Like I said to the other lady, there's no difference in terms of those rules and regulations. There's no difference between them. It's just a way to take your money out of the big banks, and drain some of their power.
And just to put,
She said unless we own 50% of the shares, and then we can maybe have some say, but we're still governed on the Canadian bank rules. But that is the reason we're looking at this one credit union, because it has a low number of people, that we can get enough freedom people to join this and take over this particular credit union. That is our intention, and we're certainly researching it. We're never going to solve the problem about NDP or not here tonight, because we have quite a few politicians in this room here tonight, and some that are like the opposite of NDP. But we'll certainly, your 10 points of anything but liberal and conservative, all of us will cheer for that one. So thank you very, very much. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure being here, guys. This is my first, but it won't be my last. David's been bugging me for a long time to get up here, and I really enjoyed it, and thank you. And guys, my email's up there. I'm going to make these materials available through the moderators. And so, don't hesitate to reach out after the fact and write to me if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. Thank you.